They died in silence, not in the trenches of war, but in their own villages, surrounded by empty fields and a world that had turned its back on them. While Europe rebuilt and celebrated victory, millions of voices in Bengal were smothered by hunger, their stories buried under the weight of imperial pride and global amnesia. This was not an unavoidable tragedy. It was the result of decisions, deliberate, calculated, and devastating. And yet, history barely whispers their names. The Irish Potato Famine is etched into the memory of the world, a catastrophe of hunger, death, and migration. Entire villages emptied, ships carried desperate families across the Atlantic, and the image of a starving people became a permanent scar on history. But there was another famine, far more deadly, that history has quietly buried. It struck not the green fields of Ireland, but a land far larger, more populous, and deeply bound to the machinery of empire. Millions perished, and yet their suffering has been reduced to footnotes, overshadowed by other tragedies of the 20th century. This is the story of the Great Bengal Famine of 1943, a disaster so vast that even the most harrowing accounts could never capture the full scope of human loss. A famine not born solely from drought or blight, but from deliberate choices, imperial policies, and a war that devoured resources without mercy. In the early 1940s, Bengal was a jewel in the eastern wing of British India. It was a fertile land, nourished by the silt-rich rivers of the Ganges Delta. Rice paddies stretched as far as the eye could see, rippling in the warm wind. Markets were alive with the sound of bargaining, the aroma of spices, and the sight of silks dyed in vibrant colors. Fishermen hauled nets heavy with river fish, and families tended to plots that had fed them for generations. From a distance, it seemed abundant, almost immune to the specter of hunger. But beneath this facade, the soil of Bengal was already being drained, not of nutrients, but of security. For nearly 2 centuries, colonial rule had reshaped its economy. Heavy taxation squeezed farmers. Local industries, once thriving, had been dismantled in favor of British-manufactured goods. The countryside was dotted with reminders of this economic inversion. Once prosperous weaving villages reduced to poverty, farmlands forced into growing cash crops for export instead of food for local mouths. When the Second World War broke out in 1939, Bengal's fate became even more precarious. The region's location on the Bay of Bengal placed it dangerously close to the Japanese advance through Burma. It became a strategic asset, and a pawn in a much larger game of global conflict. British war planners saw Bengal not as a home for millions, but as a supply point in the wider theater of war. Then, in October 1942, nature delivered its first blow. A massive cyclone swept in from the bay, its winds tearing through coastal villages, and its tidal waves drowning rice fields in salt water. Roofs were ripped from homes, boats smashed to splinters, and entire harvests swept away in a single night. Saltwater intrusion left farmlands poisoned for seasons to come. On the heels of the storm, a fungal blight attacked the rice crop, turning fields black with rot. Yet even this double disaster was not enough to cause famine on the scale that was about to unfold. Famines of nature, cruel as they are, often strike. In isolation, and recovery, though painful, can begin when food is redistributed. What happened in Bengal was different. It was famine amplified, multiplied, and prolonged by human policy. At the center of this policy was the British colonial administration under Prime Minister Winston Churchill's war cabinet. Britain, fighting for survival in Europe and North Africa, was desperate for resources. Grain was not just food. It was fuel for armies, for factory workers, for sustaining the empire's global war effort. From the ports of Calcutta, ships loaded with rice sailed not to starving villages inland, but to feed British troops and to build emergency reserves for future military campaigns. Compounding this was the infamous boat denial policy. Fearing a Japanese invasion through Burma and into Bengal, the British military ordered the destruction or confiscation of tens of thousands of small boats in coastal and riverine districts. The logic was simple. If the Japanese landed, they would be deprived of local transport. But in doing so, the policy severed a lifeline. Boats were not merely tools of war. They were the arteries of Bengal's food supply. They carried fish from river to market, ferried rice between villages, and allowed farmers to trade for what they could not grow. Without them, countless communities were stranded, cut off from both food and income. By late 1942, the impact began to show in the markets. Food prices rose at a rate never before seen. The daily wage of a laborer could no longer buy even a small bowl of rice. Fishermen, robbed of their boats, had nothing to sell and no means to feed their families. Weavers and craftsmen, already impoverished by decades of colonial economic policy, saw their earnings vanish into the inflated cost of food. The signs of impending catastrophe were visible to anyone who cared to look. Reports from district officers spoke of families selling their possessions for grain, of mothers going without food so their children could eat, of elderly villagers collapsing in the fields from exhaustion. But in Calcutta, the capital, the wealthy continued to dine well. The famine was not yet visible in the city's colonial clubs or in the official statistics, and that for the government was enough reason to dismiss the warnings. When the first waves of starvation began to sweep through the countryside, they were met with bureaucratic indifference. Officials in London and New Delhi insisted that the reports were exaggerated or caused by local hoarding. Relief efforts were delayed by arguments over cost, logistics, and the priority of the war effort. The possibility that imperial policy itself had caused or worsened the famine was not even entertained. The attitudes at the very top were chilling. Winston Churchill himself, when asked to release grain from British reserves or divert shipments to India, is recorded as responding with contempt, blaming the crisis on what he called Indians breeding like rabbits. This was not mere cruelty of words. It translated into policy. Ships that could have carried grain to Bengal were instead sent elsewhere, or even sailed empty to save fuel for the European war. Meanwhile, in the villages, hunger became a daily terror. Parents began to skip meals so their children might survive another day. Then the children, too, began to wither. Swollen bellies, stick-thin limbs, hair turning a brittle orange, the unmistakable signs of severe malnutrition. Grain merchants, sensing profit, hoarded rice in warehouses, waiting for prices to climb higher. Speculators treated hunger as an opportunity, and in the absence of government intervention, the market rewarded them. By the first months of 1943, the famine was unstoppable. Whole communities began to disintegrate. Villagers who had never left their homes were now walking for days in search of food, only to collapse by the roadside. Corpses were left where they fell, sometimes covered with a thin cloth, sometimes left to the elements. Stray dogs and crows became common sights around the edges of towns. The colonial administration's silence was not just a lack of compassion, it was deliberate. Wartime censorship ensured that the famine received little coverage in the British press. Foreign journalists were restricted from visiting the worst affected areas. The suffering of millions was kept from the front pages, replaced by news of victories and setbacks in faraway battles. By mid-1943, the seeds of catastrophe had fully borne their harvest. Hunger and disease marched together, claiming lives at a pace that defied comprehension. Villages that had stood for centuries vanished in the space of months, their inhabitants scattered or dead. And still, from the ports of Bengal, rice continued to leave for other parts of the empire. The Great Bengal Famine was no longer a looming threat. It was a living, breathing disaster. But for the men in distant offices who could have changed its course, it remained a secondary concern, an unfortunate byproduct of war, not a priority worth diverting ships or grain. In the months to come, this indifference would seal the fate of millions more. The famine was not a sudden storm, nor an act of God. It was a slow, grinding collapse, a chain of events set in motion by a colonial system that saw Bengal as a resource to be exploited, not a people to be protected. And by the time the world truly noticed, it was already far too late. By the middle of 1943, rural Bengal had become a vast, silent graveyard. Villages that had once echoed with the chatter of daily life now lay still, the air heavy with the stench of decay. The fields, normally alive with the rustle of rice stalks, were abandoned. The only sounds were the buzzing of flies over the unburied and the occasional wail of someone discovering yet another body. Hunger had stripped the land not only of life, but of its very rhythm. On the dirt roads that connected one village to another, children wandered aimlessly. Their heads were too large for their withered bodies, their bellies grotesquely swollen from protein deficiency. Their eyes seemed to have receded deep into their skulls, giving them a look of premature age. Many were too weak to speak, let alone cry. They simply sat in the dust, waiting for something or someone to save them. Mothers clutched limp infants to their breasts, rocking them out of instinct, unable or unwilling to accept the stillness that meant their children were gone. Some refused to bury their dead, convinced that if they could only find food, life would return. Others, their own strength spent, left bodies where they fell, unable to summon the energy to dig graves. And yet, only a few miles away, the colonial capital of Calcutta was bustling. The city's markets overflowed with sacks of rice, wheat, pulses, and spices. Tea shops served steaming cups to well-dressed patrons. The wealthy dined in hotels where multi-course meals were still served without interruption. For those who had money, the famine barely existed. For those without, it was inescapable. This was not, historians now agree, a famine of absolute scarcity. Bengal still had rice. The problem lay in who could afford it. Prices had spiraled so high that for most, food might as well have been locked away behind iron gates. The shortage was manufactured, the result of grain hoarding, speculative, price manipulation, and colonial requisitioning for the war effort. Merchants, knowing the desperation in the air, withheld stock to sell later at higher prices. Traders moved food to black markets where it could fetch enormous sums. Economist Amartya Sen, who grew up in Bengal during this period, would later describe it as an entitlement failure, a collapse not of food supply, but of the ability to access it. Starvation in this famine was a matter of money, not harvest. The poorest laborers, fishermen, and artisans had their purchasing power stripped away, leaving them unable to buy the very food piled in nearby warehouses. As hunger gnawed at the body, it also weakened the immune system. Soon, disease joined the war against the people. Cholera spread swiftly through villages with no clean water. Dysentery tore through crowded shelters where the starving had gathered. Malaria, ever present in Bengal, claimed even more victims among the undernourished. These illnesses did not simply kill on their own. They hastened the deaths of those already on the edge, turning hunger into a swift executioner. Relief camps, when they appeared, often did little to help. Overcrowded and under-resourced, they became breeding grounds for infection. People traveled for days to reach them, only to find that there was no food left, or that disease was rampant within. Aid workers, many of them volunteers with no formal training, were overwhelmed by the sheer numbers of the sick and dying. There were not enough doctors, not enough medicine, not enough clean bedding. In many camps, the dead and living shared the same space until removal was possible. Even as the death toll mounted, grain continued to leave Bengal. Shipments went to feed soldiers in other parts of the British Empire, or to build reserves in case of a Japanese invasion that never came. To those in power, the war was a greater priority than the lives of the empire's colonial subjects. Letters and telegrams from Indian officials poured into the offices of the British government, pleading for relief shipments. The governor of Bengal warned of the scale of the disaster and the urgency of sending grain from other provinces or from overseas. But Churchill's war cabinet refused, arguing that any spare food should go to build reserves for Europe. At one point, Australia offered to send wheat to India. The offer was accepted, but the ships carrying it were diverted mid-journey to the Mediterranean instead. Churchill's own statements reveal the mindset that shaped this policy. When pressed about the famine, he dismissed the victims as the architects of their own suffering, citing population growth as the cause. His reasoning was coldly utilitarian. The war demanded resources, and those resources would not be diverted to colonial populations, no matter how dire their need. The press, which in another country might have exposed the scale of the tragedy, was firmly under control. Wartime censorship meant that newspapers could not freely report on the famine's extent. When articles did appear, they framed the crisis as a result of local mismanagement, hoarding, or bad weather. Anything but imperial policy. Foreign journalists were heavily restricted. Some were denied permission to visit Bengal at all. Others were guided through carefully selected areas that showed little sign of the devastation. Without photographs of skeletal children or streets lined with the dead, the story could not capture global attention in the same way that other tragedies did. The world, already consumed by the tides of the Second World War, looked elsewhere. News from Europe and the Pacific dominated headlines: battles won and lost, cities bombed, and armies advancing. In this flood of wartime reporting, the silent deaths of millions in a far-off colonial province were barely a ripple for those living. Through it, this absence of recognition was almost as bitter as the hunger itself. They saw that food existed, but it was guarded by price or politics. They saw ships in Calcutta's harbor laden with rice, but not for them. They heard the government's reassurances that all was under control, even as their neighbors collapsed. Beside them, some tried to resist. Local activists and nationalist leaders demanded that the British divert resources to Bengal. They organized private relief efforts, gathering donations from other parts of India. Small shipments of grain did arrive, but they were a drop in an ocean of need. By the time relief became more consistent, it was too late for millions. In the Iri countryside, the collapse of rural life was accelerating. Farmers abandoned fields they could no longer tend, either because they were too weak or because they had sold their tools for food. Artisans and craftsmen, unable to sell their goods, joined the exodus toward the cities, hoping to find work or charity. But in Calcutta, thousands of migrants crowded into makeshift shelters, sleeping under bridges or in railway stations. Disease thrived in these conditions, and municipal authorities struggled to cope. By late 1943, the famine was no longer an unfolding disaster. It was an entrenched reality. The death toll rose steadily, but the machinery of empire continued to function as though nothing had changed. Bureaucrats filed reports, ships followed their schedules, and military priorities eclipsed humanitarian needs. The empire's gaze remained fixed on the war's great theaters, and Bengal was left to starve in the shadows. The Great Bengal Famine had become a calamity in plain sight, seen by those who lived it, hidden from those who might have acted. And as the months wore on, the separation between the living and the dead became thinner. Families no longer wept when someone passed. They simply moved the body aside. Survival consumed every thought, every action. The famine had stripped away not only life, but the very capacity for grief. And still, beyond Bengal's borders, the world turned away. By the time the famine loosened its grip in late 1944, Bengal was a land transformed by absence. Entire districts had been hollowed out, their populations reduced by a third. Official British records put the death toll at around 3 million. Yet many historians, drawing on district reports and eyewitness accounts, argue the figure was closer to 4 million. The truth will never be known with certainty, because the dead of Bengal left little behind. No gravestones, no formal rolls of the lost, only the memories of survivors and fragments of local records. Those who lived through it carried the scars for the rest of their lives. Many were physically broken, weakened permanently by months of malnutrition. Some lost eyesight from vitamin deficiencies, others suffered from stunted growth or chronic illness. Orphans wandered from village to village, surviving on scraps and charity, often separated forever from surviving relatives. Families that had stood for generations vanished entirely, their names and histories erased in the space of a single year. For the survivors, silence became a way of coping. Many refused to speak of what they had endured, partly from the trauma of reliving it, partly from the shame of having been reduced to desperation. Under British rule, open criticism of the government's handling of the famine could invite punishment. And even after independence, the famine carried a kind of social stigma. Those who had begged or scavenged were often seen unfairly as tainted by that experience. Few families had the means to preserve their histories in writing. Rural Bengal in the 1940s was still largely illiterate, and those who might have recorded the events were often the first to die. Teachers, clerks, the literate farmers who handled village accounts. What was left behind were stories told in whispers, passed from elders to children, often stripped of dates or political context. A grandson might hear that his grandfather had died in the Great Hunger, without ever learning why. There were political reasons for the famine's erasure as well. As India moved toward independence in 1947, the famine became a point of deep shame for the British Empire. For Indian nationalists, it was yet another example of the destructive nature of colonial rule, but one that risked overshadowing the unity and hope of the independence movement if dwelled upon too much in public discourse. For the departing British, it was a stain on an empire they preferred to remember as a civilizing force. In post-war Britain, the political climate made it easier to forget. Winston Churchill, the man at the helm during the famine, was lionized as the savior of democracy, the defiant voice who had stood against Hitler when all seemed lost. In this narrative, there was no room for the story of a famine in a distant colony, a famine that could be traced, in part, to decisions made in his war cabinet. To question Churchill's legacy in the years immediately after the war was to invite accusations of ingratitude or disloyalty. Western history books of the mid-20th century devoted their pages to the Holocaust, the Blitz, the Normandy landings, and the Pacific War. These were events tied to the dominant narrative of good triumphing over evil. Bengal's famine did not fit neatly into that framework. It was not the work of an enemy, but the byproduct of an ally. It was easier for governments and publishers alike to let it fade into the margins. And so, outside of South Asia, the Bengal famine remained largely unknown. When it was mentioned at all, it was often in passing, framed as a tragic but unavoidable side effect of wartime shortages. The language used stripped it of agency. Phrases like crop failure or natural disaster implied that the famine was an act of nature, a cruel twist of fate, rather than the result of deliberate policies. Even today, in many Western classrooms, the famine is not part of the curriculum. School children might learn about the Irish Potato Famine, the Dust Bowl in America, or the Siege of Leningrad, but Bengal's dead remain in the shadows. When the famine is acknowledged, it is often condensed to a single paragraph, an afterthought. In the broader story of World War II, this neglect has consequences. Without public memory, the lessons of the famine are easily lost. One of those lessons is that famine is rarely the inevitable result of natural forces alone. It is often the culmination of human decisions about who eats and who does not, whose lives are worth saving and whose can be sacrificed for a larger goal. In Bengal's case, the calculus of empire determined that colonial subjects were expendable when set against the demands of war. Remembering the Bengal famine also challenges the comforting myths that empires often weave about themselves. It forces a confrontation with the reality that imperial rule was not simply a matter of railways and legal codes, but of extraction and control, often at the expense of human life. To accept that millions died, not because there was no food, but because the systems in place denied them access to it, is to acknowledge the moral bankruptcy at the heart of those systems. The Irish Potato Famine rightly remains a symbol of oppression and resilience. Its story is told in textbooks, memorials, and literature. In Ireland and among the Irish diaspora, it is a touchstone of identity, a reminder of survival against impossible odds. The Bengal famine deserves the same recognition, not only for the scale of its tragedy, but for what it reveals about how power and indifference can shape the fate of entire populations. To forget it is to risk repeating it. Famines, after all, have not vanished from the world. They continue to occur, often under similar circumstances: political instability, economic inequality, and deliberate obstruction of food supplies. Remembering Bengal is not merely about honoring the dead. It is about recognizing the patterns that lead to such catastrophes and ensuring they are challenged when they appear. There are, slowly, signs of change. Historians, journalists, and filmmakers in recent decades have worked to bring the famine back into public consciousness. Oral history projects have recorded the testimonies of survivors before their voices are lost forever. Academic studies have laid bare the political decisions that worsened the crisis. Yet these efforts remain scattered, and the famine is still far from the center of public historical awareness. The work of remembrance is not easy. It requires confronting uncomfortable truths, reevaluating celebrated figures, and accepting that the victor's version of history is often incomplete. But it is necessary. The millions who died in Bengal between 1943 and 1944 were not simply victims of bad harvests or distant battles. They were victims of a system that calculated their worth and found it less than the grain it withheld. In the end, the famine leaves us with a choice, the same choice that faced those in power at the time: to look away, as the world did then, or to face it directly, with the recognition that such suffering is neither inevitable nor acceptable. By telling the story, by refusing to let it fade into the shadows, We honor not just the memory of those who perished, but also the countless unnamed who endured. And in doing so, we guard against the repetition of such cruelty. The Great Bengal Famine was a tragedy, but it is also a warning. It reminds us that the causes of famine are as much about politics as they are about nature, that the difference between plenty and starvation is often determined not by the harvest, but by the choices of those who control it. And choices, unlike the weather, can change.